local restaurants that are within walking distance of here. Again, in the interest of protecting your parking spaces, we might encourage you to walk there as opposed to driving and having to park on the way back. We've tried to leave a little extra time, but you might want to tell your servers that you're hustling back for a workshop, and hopefully you'll get better service. Okay? Thanks, Lundy.
Okay, I'm on a cordless here. It doesn't sound like I'm on yet, so let me see. Did that do it? Am I on now? It sounds exactly the same either way. Oh, no, now I can hear it. Okay. So I'm happy that I'm here, and it's somewhat miraculous that I'm here. I don't know if they told you, but my flights were canceled, and my airline would not do anything to help me figure out how to get here. They said, if it's weather, it's not our problem. You're on your own. All our other flights are full, and best of luck to you. And so I switched airlines that routed me through Chicago, which is almost like saying we don't really think you'll make it either. But anyhow, I did make it to Spokane only a few hours after I was supposed to be there, and I did get here in time for breakfast. So here we go. So I'll tell you briefly a little bit about my background and my perspective. I started now, it's almost 20 years ago, it's 19 years ago, I guess, that I started working with men who batter as a counselor. And in my early days of doing this work, our clients came almost exclusively voluntarily, because the courts were not at that point, in the late 80s, requiring batterers very much to go to batterer counseling programs. And now, as we found, no abuser comes truly voluntarily to a counseling program. He comes there because somebody's making him be there. So before the days that courts were making the man be there, the woman was making the man be there. And she was doing that either by threatening to leave him, or by having already left him, or by getting a protective order from the court that gave her some kind of clout because it kept him out of the house. Or it was because he'd been sleeping on the couch for 3 months and was hoping to get back in the bed if he did some counseling. But there was always some external motivation. Oh my gosh. That's great. I don't have to be the talking shadow. There was always some external motivation that was bringing him to us. Now, that also meant that the most dangerous abusers we were rarely seeing, because for the most dangerous abusers, there was no way for the woman to have the clout to make him go to counseling. She's just trying to save her life. And it also meant that some of the most psychologically destructive, manipulative batterers, even at lower levels of violence, we didn't really tend to see, because they were too effective at making the woman look like she was the one that was crazy, or getting her completely self-blaming, or, again, it was impossible for her to get herself into a position of having enough strength, emotional support, and economic support to be able to demand anything from him or make any rules about what he could or couldn't for a similar severity of violence towards someone that you've never been involved with as a partner. In other words, we still have, as a society, an exception for being violent or terrorizing towards someone if you are now or have ever had a romantic relationship with them. Particularly, by the way, if you're male. Statistically speaking, women who are convicted of crimes of violence towards male partners or past male partners don't seem to have quite the same license in how their sentencing is turning out. So we started to have now a broader range of batterers through the 90s, because people suddenly were getting caught who otherwise would have been able to get away with it, because they were so terrifying or so manipulative. Unfortunately, it also meant that some of the more educated, more privileged batterers stopped being in our program very much. they were quite good at escaping the court consequence through being able to afford the great attorney or through having personal connections or all different kinds of ways. And they were now stopped coming to the program saying, oh, well, I don't want to be in there with those real batterers. And I'm going to say various things over the course of the day about what happens when we start trying to distinguish real batterers from men who just got violent towards their female partner for some other reason and aren't real batterers. And I'm going to say that one of the main things that's going to tend to happen is what we're really going to do is end up dividing those into the group of the ones who are intelligent and the ones who are not terribly bright. And the ones who are not terribly bright are going to tend to get labeled as the real batterers. And the ones who are intelligent and really know what they're on about, and that doesn't mean necessarily terribly well educated. In other words, you can be very well educated and dumb as a brick. And you can have minimal education and be really quite slick and crafty about how you do things. But and there's some other ways that that things will tend to break down when we try to decide the real batterers from the not real batterers, other than how we really wish it would break down. It'll break down, in other words, not just by sort of who's brighter and who's less bright, but it'll break down to some extent about who has the more likable victim versus who has the less likable victim. It'll break down partly on who's better looking and who's less good looking, believe it or not. It'll break down on certain things about the history of the case. And if we're going to try to protect children, we've really got to be careful about trying to divide batterers up into different types if it's actually what we're going to end up doing is making different categories that aren't. And I'll talk some about some of the issues that we can get snared in there. I became increasingly interested, first of all, the reason I'm talking about the way that my clients changed in their nature over the years that I was running groups for men who batter is it means that I've worked with batterers of a tremendous range of personal styles, tremendous differences in their levels of education, in their levels of physical violence versus reliance more on psychological abuse and intimidation and manipulation. I've worked with batterers from 20 different nations, and so I've seen a lot of different styles. And yes, there are truly important differences in how different guys operate who have history of violence towards women, including I've had an occasional client who I would not call a batterer. I have to say they've been a very, very, very small percentage. I've had many clients who in the early days in the program, I thought, oh, this isn't a real batterer. But once I've had a guy for 6 months or 8 months or 10 months, the percentage that turn out to really be there by mistake turns out to be really small. The percentage that's there because they were actually convicted of a crime or pled guilty to a crime that they really are probably innocent of, or the percentage that are there who did do the act of violence, but it was really deeply out of character for them. They didn't show the kinds of behavior patterns and attitudinal patterns that are typical of men who batter, were a really, really small percentage. And I think that's important to focus on because it tends to indicate that most men who are using any form of violence towards females are batterers. Not 100%, but up there very, very high. And if I didn't have a camera rolling, or maybe sometime later in the day with a camera not rolling, I may ask for people who are comfortable doing that to just raise hands, not to talk anything else, women about certain aspects of their experience with male violence, but I don't want to do it right now. And I'm not sure we're going to try that at all. But I became increasingly concerned over the years that I was doing this work with the impact that my clients were having on children in the home. I also became increasingly concerned about impact they were having on children even after they weren't all living together anymore. I became increasingly concerned about the post-separation impact that men who batter were having on their children. And in addition to my work running batterer groups, I started increasingly to work for courts in Massachusetts as an investigator. I worked for juvenile courts as a child abuse investigator, and I worked for family courts as a custody investigator. Now, they called it custody evaluator or guardian ad litem. I choose to use the term investigator because I believe that that's what custody evaluators should be doing. I believe they should be doing investigation, not evaluation. And I'll talk some over the course of the day about how I think the difference looks in those two roles and why I think it's different in what kind of information we end up putting before the court and why it's therefore different in the court's ability to make a decision that's really going to protect children where necessary and that's going to have the best chance of supporting in the long run a really healthy relationship between children and their mother, because that's the top priority in a domestic violence case, is children's relationship with their mother. And then secondarily, we'll have the best chance of promoting a healthy relationship, not just any relationship, between children and their battering fathers. It's not that difficult to promote a relationship between children and their battering fathers. What's difficult is to promote a relationship that's actually going to work for those children with their battering fathers, that's actually going to be good for them. That's the trick. But the research on children's exposure to battering, and by the year 2007, there's a lot of it. A lot of research has accumulated, particularly in about the last 15 years. And one point that's more or less unanimous among researchers is that the number one protective factor for children who have been exposed to battering is the quality of their relationship with their mother, with the non-battering parent, which overwhelmingly is the mom when we're talking about domestic violence. And so we have to make sure in how we craft custody and visitation determinations that we're not doing that our efforts to promote children's relationship with their battering dad are not in any way backfiring against their relationship with their mother. Because according to the research, if we're doing that, we're making the number one error from the point of view of promoting the long-term well-being of those children. And we'll talk quite a bit about what some of the different issues are there. I don't, by the way, do direct work with batterers anymore. I haven't now for over 2 years because I'm on the road so much that I can't realistically be present on any kind of regular basis for a group. And one thing that you really need to do when you're working with men who batter is be very, very consistently present because things can go haywire really quickly. And so I had to stop doing the work. Because I did the work for so many years, I still tend to slip into talking in the present tense. My clients do this, my clients do that, as opposed to my clients did this or my clients did that. So I'm just asking you to be understanding about that in advance, even though I don't do the work anymore. I just can't seem to remember because of how long I was doing it. It felt like I did it forever. I worked with about over 1,000 batterers directly, and because I did so much clinical supervision for batterer programs, I supervised easily another 1,000 cases. And so my head is kind of full up with these things, and I forget sometimes that I don't do it anymore. And don't really, honestly, ever hope to do it again. Although I did about 2 or 3 days ago, for the first time in these 2 or 3 years that I haven't been doing this, get an urge to lead a batterer group. And I'm not sure what came over me. And I think it's partly that I'm always learning, and so there's an urge to go out there and try some things that I didn't try before. How many of you folks here do any kind of counseling or direct rehabilitative work with men who batter? I do think that we are learning certain things as the years go by about how to be more effective, although outcome research is still suggests that we're not doing terribly well. But what people forget often when they look at the outcome results of batterer programs is to compare it to the outcome results of substance abuse programs or the outcome results of sexual offender programs or weight loss programs or other programs where people have really, really deep chronic behavioral problems. There aren't a lot of people who go one time through their alcohol program and boom, they never drink again. They're all set. Sexual offenders, we know even after extensive counseling, we have to be monitoring them like hawks and holding them accountable in all kinds of ways. And yet we expect that we can send a guy to a 16 or a 26-week, or if we're lucky, a 40-week batterer program, and he's supposed to be fixed. He's not supposed to reoffend, and we're not even supposed to have to watch him very closely. We're going to just turn him loose. He's going to now have unsupervised contact with his children. We'll tell him to drop in if he perceives that there's any problems. So I think when we look at batterer counseling in the context of other similar projects, maybe it's not doing as badly as some people say it is. And there's some research showing that we are having some impact and that it is worth attempting. But all the research that I've seen shows that the batterer programs that are having some significant impact on reducing recidivism are doing so in the context of working with batterers who are being held tightly accountable by the court systems that they're involved with. And Ed Gondorf's research I find quite persuasive on this point. Ed Gondorf found quite a bit more effect from batterer programs than most other studies have found. But he was also studying batterers that were involved in really tight court systems, that were no-nonsense kind of court systems. And although that's looking at criminal court, I'd say we need to bring the same mindset to family law proceedings. That to the extent that a battering man figures out that we're not really going to carry through on holding him accountable to the conditions of visitation or the conditions of custody that he's being given, the batterer program is not going to have any significant impact. And I don't know a lot about the Montana situation. I do know a lot in a lot of other states. But in general, in family law proceedings, there's been a failure to hold men who batter to the conditions that they've been told are placed upon them. They, for example, will be told that they have to do the batterer program, but they don't ever do it, and it doesn't seem to have much impact on the progress of their visits going from supervised to unsupervised, or their unsupervised visitation going to overnights, or the general trend towards what they call normalizing the relationship between batters and their children. And I'm going to argue, by the way, that that relationship should not ever be normalized unless we start to see indications that he is truly a rehabilitated batterer. And there are ways to measure that. We also know it's not terribly common for really profound, long-lasting rehabilitation. And I'm not saying that relationship shouldn't move. There are times when it is time to go towards unsupervised contact. There are times when you have unsupervised contact that it is time to go towards overnight visitation. But I don't think that should ever go towards looking like a normal, what you would call a normal relationship. In other words, what the kind of relationship that parent would have, that child would have with a non-custodial parent that was not a batterer, unless we see very, very persuasive indications that he has changed. Similar to what we would probably want to do if the non-custodial parent was a drug dealer. And I don't choose the drug dealer analogy lightly. We have in the United States, the last statistic I saw per year, about 3,300 drug-related deaths. And the last statistic I saw, about 2,500 domestic violence-related deaths. And those statistics, by the way, are increasing as we get better at realizing which deaths were domestic violence related. There isn't really evidence that domestic violence killing is on the increase. In fact, there's some evidence that it's on the decrease. But the statistics are coming up because a lot of cases of killings of women or children where there was not previous proper identification that this had been done by a battering man, there's now a much greater likelihood for that to be properly identified. And so, in certain ways, the numbers are rising. So, in other words, the difference in the United States between our number of annual drug-related deaths and our number of annual domestic violence-related deaths is not that large. 3,300 versus 2,500, it's a difference, but it's not, we're not talking a completely different order of business. A particular battering man in a particular calendar year has only slightly less chance of being responsible for somebody's death than a drug dealer does. And of course, there are batterers who are much less severe batterers, much less dangerous batterers than other batterers. There are drug dealers who are much less severe than other drug dealers. The person who sold an ounce of marijuana versus the person who sold the boatload of cocaine. Yes, there are differences, but on average, the risk of death is similar. On average, the risk of teaching your children a very unhealthy way of life is similar. Teaching your children a very, very unhealthy set of values is similar. Raising your children in an atmosphere where there are a lot of dangerous things to which you're being exposed are similar. And yet we have a completely different mindset about when we should give a batterer unsupervised contact with children than when we would give a established or strongly suspected drug dealer unsupervised contact with children. Not to mention custody, because batterers are very, very often awarded custody of children. I've become somewhat known as the custody guy, for better and worse, because of the batterer's parent and also because of the things that I have written about child custody in both of my other books. And I get approximately 5 new calls per week, sometimes as many as 3 new calls in a day, from women across the United States and occasionally from Canada and occasionally from the UK or Australia, from women who are very, very upset on the telephone, who have just received a custody evaluation report that's recommending custody to the batterer, or have lost custody to the batterer, or they've had a series of court orders that let them know which way the wind is blowing, or they have already lost custody. And there are remarkable similarities, stunning, I would say, similarities to the stories that these women are telling me, regardless of what state they come from, what class background they have, their race, or the particular style of the abuser. In other words, whether he would fit more our image of who's a real batterer or who's not a real batterer. And we'll talk later about what some of these elements are that are turning up in story after story after story. But the underlying point that we have to take away from this, that I know is uncomfortable and I know it's unpleasant, but I really think we need to do it, is that the way we're doing things is not working for battered women and their children. And we're not doing well at discerning who's the real battered woman from who's the woman who's using these allegations as a tactic. We have an awful lot of women being labeled as using these allegations as a tactic who, upon closer examination, are involved in very, very bona fide situations with really, really justified concerns about their children. So we have to get much better at making these distinctions that we believe we're making about which cases are cases to worry about and which cases are not. And we have to be very, very careful about how a whole set of tools that we're currently using, in particular psychological evaluation, but also numerous other tools that we're currently using to discern what kind of contact children should have with their battering dads. We have to be very concerned about what the actual impact is on the ground of the way in which we're currently doing things. And I do believe, and I'm going to lay out for you this afternoon, I do believe that there are approaches that are much more research-based and that are also just much more based on the actual experiences that battered mothers are telling us about what happens post-separation. To make determinations about what kind of contact men who batter should have with their children in the present, and also how to set up a much more useful and meaningful set of criteria about when he's ready for less supervised or more extensive kinds of contact in the future, so that we can serve battered women and their children much more effectively. Now, one thing that you hear a lot in family law proceedings is we're not here to deal with what's good for the parents. We're here to deal with what's good for the children. And we don't want to hear about the parents' difficulties. We don't want to hear about what the parents are going through or what's fair to them. We want to focus on what's good for the children. Whether we practice this or not, I'm not sure. But I do hear that language used a lot. What the research is telling us about domestic violence is that that's not a properly made separation in a case where there's a history or a strongly suspected history of domestic violence. That in fact, how well children heal is quite heavily linked to how well their mother heals. And that when we make court orders that we say we're only focusing on what's good for the children here, we're not going to focus on what the needs are of the battered mother, then we're actually not focusing very well on the needs of those children, because we're making a false separation. So that's another one of the central issues that we'll have to struggle with in the months and years ahead, about how we're going to zero in on what is it that children really need who've been exposed to a history of battering, and it's not just that they've been exposed to this history, it's that there's a battering man who's not going to magically turn into somebody else that's going to continue to play an important role in their lives. Current research suggests that domestic violence continues to be underreported rather than overreported in family law proceedings. I'm not saying there's never a false allegation. I'm not saying there's never an exaggerated allegation. I'm not saying that there's never someone who's using domestic violence allegations for vengeful purposes. What I'm saying is, currently, that's not the number one problem. The number one problem is actually cases where there's a history of domestic violence that's not being talked about by either parent. So the underreporting is still the more serious concern than the overreporting. So one of the fundamental shifts that I believe we need to make in our mindset is, rather than being focused on how are we going to catch those people, and let's face it, people are really saying how are we going to catch those women, even though men also make false allegations of domestic violence, and men also make false allegations of child sexual abuse. And by the way, there's really strong research on false allegations of child sexual abuse showing that they come essentially equally from fathers and mothers. And yet all we ever hear about is those women with their false allegations of child sexual abuse. I've been involved as a guardian ad litem in a case where there were false allegations of being a domestic violence victim being brought by a man. It became quite clear over time, although I did not become convinced in that case that he was a batterer either, because that's who'd be most likely to bring such a false allegation, is actually a perpetrator. In that case, it didn't appear that he was a perpetrator. But his own claims completely broke down when I went to evidence. I've been involved in cases as a guardian ad litem where a mother was I honestly, believe it or not, have not had cases of complete fabrication that well, no, that's not true. I had one case that really did look like complete fabrication where she was trying to cover for her own history of violent behavior. I have had a couple cases where what there was quite clear indications of tremendous exaggeration of the domestic violence allegations once they were properly investigated. It's not terribly common. I do a much more thorough investigation than I find most custody evaluators do. And I find that the more thorough an investigation you do, the higher percentage of allegations prove true. And if there were tons and tons of false allegations out there, then the opposite should be true. The more thorough an investigation I do, the more false allegations I should find. Research, by the way, on child sexual abuse finds the same thing, that the more thorough the evaluation, the more allegations are proven true, rather than that the more allegations are proven false. Again, I'm not trying to dismiss concerns about false allegation. What I'm trying to say is an overwhelming preoccupation with false allegation is not supported by the research, and it's not supported by careful investigation in clinical cases. And that rather than having this over-preoccupation with the potential for false allegation, we should, if anything, be more concerned about how are we going to get more domestic violence cases to come out that aren't coming out. Domestic violence perpetration, a leading indicator of potential for child maltreatment. I'm going to be talking to you about what the statistics are. Numerous established risk factors. Once we know that a guy's got a history of violence towards his female partner, numerous established risk factors for an increase in risk to children. Even if his level of violence towards the mom is not particularly high, and I'll be talking some about what the research shows. Nonetheless, I still find that the primary risks to children post-separation are psychological ones, of being psychologically harmed by the abuser, greater than the risk of being physically or sexually harmed by him. Although those are also obviously psychologically harmful as well. That in the year 2007, batterers are not a mystery to us. There's an established profile of men who batter. And I'm going to zero in on that quite a bit this morning. The key point that I would like to emphasize about the profile is that this is not caused by his circumstances. These are attitudes and behaviors that he exhibits in relationship that a non-battering man will not tend to exhibit to this degree, even in a very difficult, unpleasant relationship with a woman who's a real pain in the neck or a real bad person. I'm not saying that the non-battering man is going to be perfect in his behavior when he's involved with no one's going to be perfect in their behavior when they're involved with someone who's really, really vicious and destructive. In fact, battered women get caught in this trap all the time, where people say, "Well, but didn't you call him a really bad name one day?" Well, yeah, a battered woman's going to have several days when she's called him really, really bad names. And if that means, oh, well, then they're mutually abusive, if that's your mindset, is that now you've just found mutual abuse, I think, again, you're going to tend to handle this case in a way that's going to not work out well for children. And so his profile is not going to go away because the couple isn't together anymore. And I'm going to talk about what the implications are of that profile for how we make determinations about custody and visitation. And a majority of intractable custody disputes, the kinds that drag through the court for years, involve histories of domestic violence. This is established by researchers where I disagree with almost everything else they have to say. Even those researchers acknowledge that domestic violence is one of the top causes of ongoing intractable custody disputes. A quick word here about the term high conflict divorce. I'm actually going to ask you to drop that term until there's some good research supporting it. And I'll tell you why. The research on high conflict divorce involves perhaps as high, according to Janet Johnston, and she's one of the big people promoting this research, perhaps as high as 75% cases of domestic violence. Well, for those who work in research, this is called contaminated research. What it means is that your findings are being contaminated by the presence of another problem in your research sample. If you've got 50 to 75% domestic violence cases in your research sample about high conflict divorce, it means that everything you're saying in your findings about what is the nature of a high conflict divorce may not be the nature of a high conflict divorce. It may be the nature of divorcing a battering man and how batterers tend to conduct themselves post-separation, the kinds of positions that puts a battered woman in, and the ways that she then starts to react to her perception, often correct, that the court is not responding to her concerns about her children's safety. So until we have research on high conflict divorce that eliminates domestic violence cases from the research pool, anything we claim to know about high conflict divorce, we're claiming in a really unscientific way. And so until that research has been done, I believe we should drop the term high conflict divorce. We need to zero in on domestic violence related divorce, and when we have some solid research about what happens in other kinds of high conflict divorce, then we can start to say certain things about what happens in those divorces that'll be research based. I'm pausing here because I'm trying to think carefully about how many cans of worms I want to open at once. I think I'm going to wait on this question about measuring credibility, although I think it's a very, very important issue. I just don't want to start into it until you've at least had something to eat. And the court needing access to extensive information of specific kinds is a problem I'm going to be talking about a lot today. I'm going to be upfront with you from the beginning. It's not a problem that I entirely have a solution to. I'm going to propose some solutions. But in many ways, the solution to the court getting the kind of information that it needs is a policy level legislative problem. It's not even the problem that the court can solve, because it's about the need for state legislatures to start to give courts that handle family law proceedings a much, much greater much greater financial resources for performing custody evaluation. And what I'm going to argue actually is that custody evaluators should be employees of the court that are being supervised and accountable to the court, and that their reports should be only gathering facts. They should not be making recommendations to the court. I know that this is an uncomfortable issue for judges. Judges feel like if I had to deal with all these evaluations, but they're not telling me what I should do, that's going to make an unmanageable situation for me. And I'm really sympathetic to that. I mean, the number of decisions that judges have to make in a very short time, they feel like, well, if I didn't have recommendations, it would become impossible. And I don't entirely know the solution to that, but I know that right now, evaluations with recommendations are not serving domestic violence cases well, and that I think if judges were using their own judgment about what to do with the facts that were being presented by a fact gatherer, we would be getting a much better set of orders, and I'll be explaining some of why I believe that over the course of the day. A whole set of issues here I'm going to wait on. They're really, really powerful and complex. One of my problems is that I sometimes do a preamble that lasts till 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and then I say, okay, now we're starting the presentation, and people say, but you've been talking for 4 hours. What do you mean now we're starting the presentation? So I'm going to try to break the habit of the endless preamble. Some of the typical behaviors that we're going to see, and when I say family court, I know often these proceedings are not actually happening in any kind of dedicated family court. What I mean by family court is whatever court is that day handling the family law proceedings. The abuser is going to deny all or most of the history of violence. I often see people involved in these proceedings put a lot of weight on the fact that the alleged perpetrator denies that the violence took place. Every true perpetrator is going to deny that the violence took place, and the falsely accused is going to deny that the violence took place, right? As they should. So it means that the fact that the violence has been denied leaves us exactly back at the beginning. The abuser is also often quite shrewdly effective at minimizing the violence. In other words, sometimes he's aware that if he completely denies the violence, you're going to be more suspicious of him than if he admits to little bits of it but shapes it. And I'm actually going to give you an example of how my clients tend to sound. Let's say that a woman is alleging that during the marriage there was a time when he shoved her down a flight of stairs. And she's also reporting numerous other acts of violence against her, but not nearly as serious as that one. She's reporting times when she was slapped, shoved. Now, we might have one guy who's going to just say, none of that ever happened, wasn't there, was bowling that night, etc. Then we're going to have another guy who's going to say, all right, listen, I know I need help. I know there's been some issues in the relationship. I know I've done some bad things. I really want to deal with this issue. I really want to have a good relationship with my children. My children are really important to me. And I'm going to be honest with you because I want help. And I want our family to get help. And my wife needs some kinds of help too, and I'm hoping she's going to get some help. And there were 2 different times in the relationship when I did slap her. There was a time we were arguing, and she said my mother was a whore, and I slapped her. And I know that's no excuse. And then, okay, I was involved for a few months with another woman. That part's true. We hadn't had sex for like a year and a half, and I know that's no excuse also, but I got involved with this other woman. I was craving some affection, and I know those things are wrong, but now suddenly there's this story about I pushed her down a flight of stairs, and so this thing is just blowing all out of proportion, and I think her lawyer put her up to this, and you could kill somebody pushing him down a flight of stairs. That's something I would never do. And it just shows how this whole thing has it's just gone boom. Well, this guy is much more persuasive than the guy who says, I was bowling. And we have a natural tendency to have our heart go out to someone who's trying to be honest with us, I do at least, someone who's admitting their problems to me, someone who's saying, yeah, there's things they really need to look at. We know how uncomfortable it is to admit these things, so we feel for him because he's taking the step to admit these things. So his denial that he pushed her down the stairs suddenly starts to carry pretty heavy weight. And we start to look at her and think, what's this woman really up to? You know, what's this really about? Standard, or becoming standard tactics, at least in our time, he's going to accuse the mother of mental health problems. Increasingly, he's going to accuse her of borderline personality disorder and other kinds of personality disorder. He's going to accuse her of having substance abuse problems, and he's going to accuse her of unfit parenting. Some of these things he will be inventing out of whole cloth. Some of these things will have aspects of truth to them, and some of these things will be entirely true. We can't know, again, except by trying to see what kinds of sources of information we can go to, and very careful assessment of those things. There is a fairly decent chance that the substance abuse allegation is true because battered women have much higher rates than non-battered women of abusing substances. She may well not perform well in psychological testing. That does not necessarily show the presence of underlying mental health problems. There's essentially no psychological test being used in court proceedings today that in any useful way will distinguish underlying mental health problems from her traumatic responses to having been battered by this man. The psychological tests are not designed in the current era to in any way account, or most well, really, no, none of the tests that are used, the MMPI, the MCMI, the Rorschach, these are the ones that are most typically used in legal proceedings about custody and visitation. They will not in any way factor in the fact that she's been abused for the past 10 years. And I'll be talking more specifically about what goes on in psychological testing. It sounds like I'm going to be here for days, doesn't it, as I lay out the things that I say we're going to be talking about. So I'm not saying these things are automatically false because he's a batterer or we're suspecting that he's a batterer. I'm just saying this is going to be typical stuff that's going to come from a bona fide batterer, and we really have to take that into account in how we think about how we're going to deal with that. Right, these are issues I've already talked about. He is quite commonly going to present as the more friendly parent. He's going to. Do you have friendly parent language in your custody statute in Montana? Yes? Most people are saying no. Many states, there's language saying that the court, as part of making a custody determination, is supposed to put weight on which parent would be more likely to support a relationship with the other parent. So yes, you do have something like that. This kind of language backfires against a parent who actually has good reason to be needing to protect those children from the other parent, which of course is going to be especially true of a battered woman. And so you will often have a batterer saying, oh, I want custody, but I want these children to have, their mother is really important, and I want them to have an extensive pattern of contact with her. And a protective mother who's saying, I actually want his visit supervised, or we really got to deal with his issues before I want them to have a lot of contact with him. Immediately, he's got the leg up for custody from the get-go, just by virtue of the fact that he's a perpetrator of domestic violence. There are other ways where just by virtue of being a perpetrator of domestic violence, he's immediately going to be in a better position for custody. We'll look at some other ones. But we've already got two. He's going to tend to outperform her on psychological testing, and he's going to tend to present as the friendlier parent if she's taking appropriate protective steps, the kind of steps I believe she needs to be taking in order to be a responsible parent. He will not seem capable of the kind of cruelty or abuse that he's accused of. It's just going to seem like it couldn't possibly be him. Out of my 1,000 clients that I've worked with directly, very few of them seemed, from point of view of what they were like, capable of doing what they had been convicted of having done. Part of what's happening a lot in family law proceedings is that we're over relying on how he seems to us. And that's hard because then what else do we have to go on? And so it puts people in a lot of situations where they don't know what on earth to do. But relying on how he seems is one of the things that's really getting us into trouble. I'll be talking more about the fact that most batterers do not have severe mental health problems. Battering is primarily a culturally driven rather than psychologically driven problem, and I'll be explaining what I mean by that, because I don't mean that it belongs to one culture, but I mean that it's primarily a problem of socialization and learned attitudes and behaviors, and often profound impact from important male role models while he was growing up. By the way, I'm not planning this morning to go into the whole question of female perpetrated domestic violence, which there is some of. If people want me to address that this afternoon, I can spend a little time on it. I don't want to begin there. We're talking about a very small percentage. It already gets more attention than it deserves, but it also does occur. So that's something I don't mind spending some time on if people want me to, but I don't want to do that now. Because battering behavior is primarily this matter of attitudes, learned behaviors, male role modeling during upbringing, and so forth, it means that the batterer tends to have considerable ability to shut the behavior off when he decides it's in his best interest to do so. So people who work in domestic violence, for example, hear hundreds of reports about a guy who just looks like he's berserk. There's a knock on the door from the police, and he's cool as a cucumber. The police come in, they find this reasonable man and a woman who's bouncing off the walls, and they say, oh, we can tell who the problem is here. And so because the behavior is not particularly out of control, when he's being watched, he's going to tend to do well. And during the years that I was doing custody evaluation, I used to read a lot of other reports by custody evaluators, people who had done previous evaluations on the same case that I was on. And I would find over and over again that they had over-relied on their impressions during an hour, hour and a half observation that they did between an alleged batterer and his children. We have to be very, very careful about what kind of conclusions we make. Well, I'll wait. There are numerous other points about what happens during observed visits, which I'll come back to. Once he's decided that he's really going to make the custody or visitation battle a focus of his attention, he can be very single-minded about it. Batterers often have great strength at their ability to focus obsessively or near obsessively on a particular goal that they have. And so for this year or 2 years or 3 years that this is dragging through the courts, he may suddenly seem like an exemplary parent. We may think, wow, he's really changed. He's really coming through for them. When you follow these cases after they're not in court anymore, which I happen to often be in a position to do, what you find is that he just goes, once the litigation is calmed down, he goes completely back to his old ways. Batterers change when they have dealt with their issues. They do not change otherwise. Batterers will say they changed because they woke up one morning and they saw the light. I realized what a terrible thing I was doing, and I'm just not that way anymore. Although sometimes he will claim that while simultaneously claiming that everything she's saying about him is false, which is... I'm talking specifically about what this all means. He'll claim he had a religious conversion and completely change. He may have had a bona fide religious conversion, and I don't want to in any way put down the powerful and wonderful things that can come out of religious conversion for people. It will not stop the battering. I've had so many of these guys who've had different kinds of epiphanies in their lives. The behavior towards intimate partners continues as it was before. Again, making the link to other issues. We don't expect someone who's been substance abusing for 10 or 15 years to just wake up one morning and decide, you know what? I don't feel like drinking today. And in fact, I don't think I feel like ever drinking again. I think I just won't. You know how long that person stays sober, right? They stay sober till about lunchtime. And yet for some reason, with men who batter, we expect that they just change because he just isn't that way anymore. And we sometimes will hear from his children that dad just isn't that way anymore. Because he's involved in currying favor during a campaign to win custody, or at least to win an extensive program of unsupervised contact with his children. And we'll look some at what motivates batterers to do that. And he can specifically gain power from children's emotional starvation. In other words, the typical batterer parenting style, which I'll come back to talk more about later, tends to be someone who does not give a lot of attention to children, does not spend a lot of time with them, is quite harshly critical of children. And so they tend to come out starved for his attention, starved for his affection, and starved for his praise and approval. In other words, all those things tend to be quite hard to come by. There are batterers of whom this isn't true. I'm talking generalities, but that's a very common sort of general picture of the parenting of men who batter. So in the midst of a custody dispute, when he suddenly turns all this attention on them, he is connecting with one of the places in them where they are most often wounded. And remember, these are children who are carrying additional wounds because of the violence that they've heard and seen in the home. So their wounds are in a sense, more raw and powerful. And when dad's suddenly on the scene, the impact of that on children can be huge. They've been craving this for years. And suddenly he's saying, oh, you're smart. Suddenly he's saying, oh, I really want to be with you. Suddenly, instead of making all these promises and not showing up, which is so much the batterer pattern, he's making promises and he is showing up. Although often also making really outlandish promises about things that are going to happen in the future. So this can really influence what children will say about him to court personnel and court-appointed personnel, because they're so starved for dad and now dad is present. And well, I think enough said about that for now. So. Sorry, I was having trouble getting, this is, I'm sorry, give me a quick moment here, all right, because I actually want to skip up and come back to some of these things. Actually, do I dare take questions? I don't know if you know what, let me do a little more before I take questions. You don't dare, huh? I know it's like putting a match under some very, very dry kindling. So it's going to be, I understand from that while I was still dragging my body out of bed this morning, things had already heated up here to some extent. And I'm sure that there'll be more of that. And we can't duck the tensions. And I don't think that the tensions are the biggest problem. I don't think that the huge differences in perspective are the biggest problem. I think the biggest problem is the failure to listen. And we've really got to get much better at hearing. And I'll give you an example from a different area. Different but related area. During my early years, my first 10 at least years in domestic violence, there was huge tension almost everywhere you went between people who worked in child protection and people who worked in domestic violence. And we were screaming at the child protection people, you don't understand what the mother has having to deal with. And child protection people were screaming at us, you don't understand our job to keep these children safe. And I was just thinking, God, those child protective people, they just have so much they need to learn from us. When are they going to wake up and realize how much they need to learn from us about battered women and about batterers as parents? And you know what? I was right. But I was only half right. Because there was so much that we needed to learn from them about what are the risks to children and what is it like to work in child protection and what are your responsibilities as does anybody here work in child protection? Not a lot of people, but a few who will immediately know what I'm talking about. That working in child protection is incredibly stressful, difficult work, and we needed to be hearing it wasn't just they need to hear us better. It was we also need to hear them better. And so the tensions have to be, they can't be skirted, they have to be gone through. I promised you some time on the batterer profile. First of all, he is a coercively controlling, dictatorial style of guy around the house. He's not necessarily this way in other contexts. Now, some abusers, they continue to just be obviously controlling through litigation, and everyone sees, oh my God, this guy's a control freak. One of my favorite stories, this is only from about 1.5 years ago, the judge starting to talk and the guy saying, Your Honor, I'm not finished yet. That probably wasn't that swift. But more commonly, he's not going to present that way in court. One of the really odd but interesting things about battering is what a specific problem it is, how specific it is to how this guy operates in partner relationship or in context that he defines as his family. So it's his partner or his family. And according to the researchers, at least 2/3 of batterers will not show these kinds of behavior patterns in any context outside of their relationships and families. And about 1/3, in my experience, it's less than 1/3, but the research says about 1/3 of batterers will, their aggressive, hostile, bullying nature will be evident in some other context in life as well. Well, actually, let me do the first 2 points, and then I'm going to say some things about how they fit together. The abuser is a highly entitled individual. He believes that his needs should be the center of the agenda, that things should revolve around what works for him. Of course, as soon as he's in family court, he's going to be talking a language about, I just care what my children need, what's good for my children. But if you watch carefully, you start to notice that what he really seems to be involved in is what's good for him, what reflects well on him, what's going to meet his needs. That means that in relationship, he tends to be very, very demanding. His demands are impossible to ever satisfy. He says jump this high, you jump that high. He says jump higher. It's never good enough. And that's often true in his parenting style as well, not always, but often true. His children just feel like they're fighting so hard to ever do something that dad is finally going to consider good enough. That level of entitlement leads to family members experiencing him as a selfish, self-centered guy a lot of the time. And like most people with self-centeredness problems, that means he's going to have times of extreme generosity. Right? For those of you who are clinicians, I'm not, but for those of you who are clinicians, that's one of the characteristics of the self-centered individual is that they tend to have times when they really turn on being there for people, everything the opposite of what we would think of as self-centered, being there for people, an almost exaggerated generosity, which they will then insist is the totality of who they are. Now, these characteristics in how he views the woman and how he views the children are not going to go away if he hasn't dealt with them. So, for example, when we say to an abused woman, as will often happen in family law proceedings, you need to forget the past and learn to get along with him for the good of the children, we are setting her an impossible task. There is no way to learn to get along with an abuser except to capitulate. Capitulation is the only route to a successful relationship with a batterer. With some batterers, even complete capitulation won't work. But we are essentially, we don't mean to be telling her this, our intentions are good, but what we are in effect telling her is capitulate. If she does not capitulate, she is going to continue to have tremendous conflicts with him for years. If she sticks up for what she really believes is in her children's best interests, she's going to continue to be fighting with him like cats and dogs for years, and she's going to be continuing to hear from the court, you people are constantly fighting. You people are never willing to let go of the past. You people are never willing to focus on what's good for the children. So when we don't deal with the domestic violence history and we don't deal with the profile, we're setting her up to then become the one that we're really frustrated at. Why does this keep coming back into court? How come there's always this concern or that concern about your children? Because we haven't addressed her concerns about her children, and because we've set her an impossible task. If we push her into mediation, if we push her into parent coordination — do you have parent coordination in Montana? I have rarely talked to an abused woman where the parent coordination was working well for her, because it's essentially a kind of trying to mediate solutions. Sending her to couples counseling. I find a lot, I don't know in Montana, but in Massachusetts and in some of the other states where I most commonly am working, Iowa, North Carolina, various other places where I seem to be, actually I've started to become a sort of recurring theme in here too, but I haven't been here to talk about post-separation issues that much specifically before. So I still don't know that much about the Montana picture here. There's often a tremendous eagerness by professionals that are involved in the case. Well, we want to get rid of this protective order. We start pressuring the woman to drop the protective order. And what we want you guys to start talking to each other, because that's what's going to start to move this case along, is when you two start to talk to each other. It won't. All I can say is it won't. It won't move the case along. It actually will feed the tensions in all kinds of ways in the years to come, and it'll make sure actually that the decisions about what's good for those children are starting to come much, much more from the batterer's judgment than from the battered woman's judgment. And I'm not saying that every battered woman has great judgment about children and that every batterer has terrible judgment about children. That's not the case. But on average, when I'm looking at children's future, I would like the battered woman's judgment about what's good for those children to be carrying a lot more weight than the batterer's judgment about what's good for those children. There's too much that I know from my clinical experience and too much that's been established in the research about what batterer's judgment is like about children. And by the way, in more recent years, just in about the last 5 years, there has started to be a body — it's not huge yet, but there has started to be a body of research about battered women as parents that is certainly finding some problems, but it's finding that they're actually doing better than we thought under really, really difficult circumstances. So we have to find a different way than to think somehow that if we get these people talking to each other, that's what's really going to make the difference about what's good for these children. And it means that we have to stop assuming that the main thing these children are suffering from is how high the level of conflict is between their parents. That's certainly hard for them. That's certainly one of the causes of their suffering. But what research would suggest is that, and certainly what my case experience suggests, is that the much greater cause of their suffering is that one of their parents is a domestic violence perpetrator. And that having one of your parents be a domestic violence perpetrator brings you all kinds of problems. And we're going to take you through a number of those today to just help you get a picture of the kinds of things that it leads to. All right. I'm not going to talk in detail about every item on every one of these screens. You'll have them to refer to, and some of these things I've just made enough. I don't want to beat them into the ground. So, yeah, I think I've talked adequately about all these points too. Well, actually, not the last one, though. One of the common misconceptions in family law proceedings is now that this couple isn't together anymore, the tensions are going to start to recede. Now, Janet Johnston, who I cite whenever her findings are helpful to me and who I slam whenever her findings are not helpful to me, in her own research, she found that even 5 and 10 years down the line — and Judith Wallerstein's research, they work together, although they have some very different perspectives, interestingly enough, although they work together — found that 5 or 10 years down the line, in so-called high conflict divorce, as they call it, tensions were typically still really high. So the notion that somehow these problems are just going to recede because they're not together anymore is not supported by the research. Tensions stay high. Now, there is very little research, unfortunately, next to none, into the parenting of men who batter post-separation. And we continue to have trouble getting anyone to fund research into the parenting of men who batter post-separation. This is a huge gap. So what we're forced to rely on is what we know from case experience and what we know from hundreds and hundreds of stories that we've gathered from battered women, which is a substantial body of information. But having more studies, there have been a few studies done in England, and those are the only studies really that we have. Marianne Hester, Lorraine Pearson, who's the other? I can tell you later. I'm blanking on the other. There's 3 British researchers who have been really the only ones that have looked done scholarly research on these post-separation behaviors. We have good indication from case experience that a batterer's risk to his children often becomes greater after separation even than it was while the family was together. Why? Well, one is, now he's going to start being alone with those children. And the mom had at least some ability to monitor his behavior while the family was together. Now she has none. 2, abusers, because of how control and domination oriented they are, don't take well to relationships splitting up. They don't like losing that control over the woman. So the children then become a very tempting vehicle to continue to abuse her through and to continue to have power over her. And again, I'm not saying all batterers do it. I'm just saying the temptation becomes a powerful one. And many batterers do. Then switch over, since they can't control her in other ways, to trying to control her through the children. The other thing is that post-separation is a very volatile time for batterers. Batterers are explosive in all kinds of ways about being left. And some of that just rage is being channeled towards the children. So for multiple reasons, and actually there's one more, which turns up in some of the child sexual abuse literature, which is that there's also some deliberate hurting of children simply for retaliatory purposes. And according to one study, about 10% of incest perpetrators admitted that their motive was to retaliate against the mother for one thing or another. 9% they found in that study. So, and I can tell you what the study is. It was written up in a book called, it's called something like Sexual Abuse of Young Children or something. It was one, I could get it for you if anybody's interested. It's cited in The Batterer's Parent. So, all right, how are we doing here? Okay. Actually, let me just stop for a moment and see if there are any questions about the batterer profile specifically, what's been established or not. Oh, actually, let me add one more thing. Ed Gondorf, was it Gondorf? Yeah, it was Gondorf. He did extensive psychological testing of court-convicted batterers. Now, when you specify batterers who have been convicted, you're already getting into a group that's more violent than the average batterer because you're more likely to get caught and you're more likely to get convicted. He found, even looking at court-convicted batterers and using the MCMI, which is, for those of you who are not clinicians, is a modern, sophisticated, one of the more advanced psychological tests. It's considered to do well not just at catching major mental illness, but at catching personality disorder. And he found that a solid majority of court-convicted batterers tested entirely normal on the MCMI, indistinguishable from non-battering men. In the minority that did test as having psychological problems, there was a higher rate of narcissistic personality disorder than you would find with non-battering men, and there was a higher rate of antisocial personality disorder than you would find with non-battering men. These are the two disorders that I wrote about in Why Does He Do That, not knowing of Gondorf's research. I wrote about those just from what I had observed clinically. And part of why I want to say that is because I get really sick of people saying, well, but you only know, and I don't mean to me. I mean in general, I get sick of people saying, oh, well, that's only been established anecdotally. Well, anecdotal evidence, when it involves a large number of cases, can be every bit as enlightening as important as things that are found in research. Research is a complicated area. I'm involved in it a lot. I don't do a lot of research, but I'm involved in reviewing research and working with researchers, consulting to researchers on a lot of projects. And first of all, you can only study what you can get funded. And secondly, you can only study things that you can study. Right? You can't study certain things that are, it's almost impossible to study certain things that are going on behind closed doors that nobody wants to tell you about. You can't really do telephone studies anymore. And we got such good information from telephone studies in the 70s and 80s That's where we got some of our most important information about domestic violence and its overlap to child maltreatment. Studies, for example, that Marie Strauss did, that you can't do anymore because people don't answer their telephones anymore. So the telephone survey has essentially vanished from research, or it's gone way down, except for more in social science research, and it's getting harder and harder to find out even what's going on out there. All right. So now I've forgotten what I was talking about. What was I talking about? There was a slight increase, or I shouldn't say slight. There was an increase in narcissistic personality and an increase in antisocial personality over non-battering men, but they still remained in the minority of court-convicted batterers. Most tested indistinguishable from non-battering men. Again, this is not primarily a psychologically driven problem, as I have already said. So. I have also just finished reading an article from a psychological journal that I meant to bring so I could read sections to you today, but I forgot to bring it, an article that I just found. Reviewing what the scientific underpinnings are, what the research underpinnings are of all the personality disorders, and finding that except for borderline personality and antisocial personality, there's essentially no scientific basis for any of the personality disorders. I was stunned. Maybe I should have known this a long time ago. But so we have to be very, very careful about anything that we're doing in legal proceedings related to diagnoses of personality disorder, because they are on no scientific ground at this point. And for anyone who's interested in knowing more about this, I'll tell you more about what this article, which was written by psychologists who are involved in diagnosis. This isn't written by me. Why that's not working. But that's not a central issue that we have to go into today, unless it's a particular interest to people.
Are you only talking about batterers who committed physical violence, or does this also include the other psychological abuse?
The question is, am I just talking about batterers who do physical abuse, or about, say, the chronically destructive psychological abuser? The answer is we don't know. I'll tell you what we do know and what we don't know. The research is done entirely, with the exception of maybe one study, I piled next to hundreds of studies. So the research is essentially entirely done on men who have used at least some degree of physical or sexual violence in their relationship. So from a research standpoint, we don't know what goes on with the pure psychological abuser. What we know anecdotally, I shouldn't even use that term. I hate that term. What we know from case and clinical experience is that many similar patterns emerge, that women are sometimes reporting quite severe psychological distress in themselves from being involved with the psychological abuser. There, for obvious reasons, is not the same level of terror. And she tends to perceive herself as having more options. So her circumstances are different. I'm not saying it's an easy thing or not a serious thing, but her circumstances appear to be different. That's all we know at this point, because we don't have anything to really draw from in a research standpoint. Now, one thing I want to add to that mix is a lot of times when women tell me he's purely a psychological abuser, I find out there's an element of physical violence, that he has grabbed her, shoved her, told her he's going to kill her, raised fists. He just hasn't hit her with those fists. Now, to me, a raised fist is not verbal abuse. That's physical abuse. I'm going to kill you is not verbal abuse. That's physical abuse. Verbal abuse is like you're fat, you're ugly, you're stupid, which is incredibly destructive too. By the way, a majority, not a large majority, but it's over 50%, a majority of battered women, physically battered women, report that the batterer's psychological abuse is more destructive to her than his physical violence is. So we certainly know in the battering case that the psychological abuse is incredibly important. Whatever we may not know about the pure psychological abuser, we do know that for the batterer, his psychological abusiveness is incredibly important. And I want to emphasize that point because in family law proceedings, women often find it very difficult to get the court to listen to anything other than physical violence or outright rape. And in fact, rape she tends to get not listened to at all in my experience. So I should really just say she only gets maybe listened to about physical violence. And she tends to be very, very eager to talk about what his psychological abusiveness has been, as over 50% of battered women will be, very eager to talk about what his psychological abusiveness has been. And I would argue that his psychological abusiveness towards her does have some predictive value in telling us how he's likely to treat the children. I'm not saying it's incredibly predictive. I'm saying it has some predictive value and does need to be part of what we're carefully listening to. I forget if there was another hand up first before you. Okay, go ahead.
In a sense, I mean, I know you can't tease out a strict psychological abuser versus, you know, obviously there's components of both probably and either. But in a sense, someone who has, a person who has more control and sophistication to stay in the realm of more threat or psychological abuse, do you think that that person in the long run would be a little, the tendency might be that they might be more dangerous because of the level of sophistication and manipulation abilities, more like a psychopath versus someone who is a lower end and more antisocial?
So the question here is, she's asking, in order to be purely psychologically abusive, or I would argue even mostly psychologically abusive with some low level of physical violence, that shows a considerable degree of self-control in a sense, and perhaps could be linked to tremendous manipulativeness and skill about what you're doing. And could that potentially be, in some ways, more destructive to children? Well, what I observe post-separation is that the really psychologically cunning batterer is yes. I guess basically what I'm just going to say is yes, that can be true. I observe that the psychologically cunning batterer, who sometimes has lower levels of physical violence, is sometimes has children who are in tremendous psychological distress and confusion, and can be particularly effective at damaging children's relationship with their mother. And remember, research is suggesting that the most severe psychological harm that batterers are doing, they're doing by harming children's relationship with their mother. There was another study, which I didn't make reference to earlier, by the way, that looked at the trauma that children were experiencing from witnessing violence. And that study found that there were found indications that the harm that was being done to their relationship with their mother was an even greater cause of their symptoms than the actual seeing of the incidents of violence. Although that's a very serious producer of symptoms also. We really need, and you'll hear about this quite a bit this afternoon, we really need to zero in on what batterers do to mother-child relationships, because that appears to be either the number one or one of the top two causes of psychological harm to children from exposure to domestic violence, is the way that batterers damage mother-child relationships. And the more shrewd and manipulative he is, the more effectively he's going to be able to do that. You get some batterers who are very physically violent, where their children are actually in somewhat less distress. And I suspect that the reason that's true is because he's so bad that you can just tell he's rotten. And so children don't have to go through some of these horrible internal conflicts that they go through when they don't know if the violence is their own fault. They don't know if the violence is mom's fault. They don't know whether to love or hate mom because they think she may be causing this violence. They don't know whether to love or hate dad because he's such a wonderful guy anytime that he's not being a terrorist. And these internal conflicts are incredibly painful and difficult for children. And children who have a guy who's just plain mean, rotten jerk, they have a lot of, I'm not trying to minimize their trauma, but there's a whole range of struggles that they're actually somewhat left out of. Children, for example, have an easier time when the batterer is stepdad than when the batterer is dad. Although, again, I'm not trying to minimize anything that people go through. They can go through terrible, terrible things. But some of those internal struggles are the worst. Numerous research studies suggest, or I would say beyond suggest, really quite conclusively show that on average, a less educated, more blue-collar oriented batterer is going to use a higher level of physical violence than the more highly educated, privileged abuser who by definition uses some level of physical violence, or he wouldn't be defined as a batterer, but who's so capable of sophisticated psychological manipulation that in a sense he's less reliant on the use of physical violence. And that's a certain percentage of the cases that end up in custody litigation, because the more well-heeled batterer often has a lot more resources to make custody litigation his tool. So, other questions on that are on the batterer profile? Yeah.
Lundy, you use the word a lot, batterer. It's a very powerful word, and the only people who use it actually are advocates. And so I'm wondering how you even introduced the word in court, because you just said it's going to be a verbally skilled man. And if we say he's a batterer, they're going to say, what are you talking about? Where's the meat? What's the proof? A batterer is a guy who puts someone in the hospital.
Right.
And you use the word over and over and over again. It's a very powerful word, and it's like you're not allowed to use it unless you have this track record
Of broken bones and broken bones, hospitalizations,
How do you
black
introduce that word into a court document?
I guess the first thought I have is perpetrator of domestic violence, which would, there's other terms that researchers are using. They're using perpetrator of intimate partner violence. That's another term that's being used quite a bit. Anybody else have suggestions on terminology? Those are the only other terms that I know about.
But those are post-conviction words.
Somebody says, how about the term, oops, did I just disconnect myself? I did. Somebody says, how about the term abuser? That still seems to be a pretty powerful term, so that might be a possibility. I think that, I mean, so much of what has to happen, which is really difficult, is that attorneys and guardians ad litem need to educate, and other people who do custody evaluation need to educate the court. And that's a real uphill battle, but that's where judges get most of their education. Judges go to some judicial training, but they get most of their education from attorneys and from professionals that they appoint on cases. So, any other suggestions for this dilemma of how to talk about this in court? Yeah.
Do you use the word? In your court documents, do you use the word batterer?
I use the term men who batter.
And does a man have to be convicted for you to use that word?
No.
Okay.
I often lay out the definition, and I often, of course, when I'm writing a court report, I'm often not even concluding, because if I'm writing a report to the court, as I was yesterday, before I dashed off the airport, I'm saying, if the court becomes persuaded that the following things are true, here's what research and other literature on domestic violence would indicate needs to be taken into account. Because judges don't like to be told ahead of time what they should conclude about what the facts are, as I'm sure you run into as an attorney. So I try to really avoid stepping on their toes in that area. Just say, here's what needs to be looked at in deciding whether it's true or not. And if you do decide it's true, here's the things that we need to consider in looking at what's going to be in children's best interests. All right. It's 10 after 12. We were going to go to a quarter after, but I'm actually at a natural stopping point. So I think what we'll do is break now. When are we asking people to try to be back?
Hour and a half.
Sorry?
An hour and a half.
Okay, so I will start again at 1:40 with whoever we have at that point.
His distinct flair for the controversial and his suggestive and provocative insights. Professor Walt has consistently addressed the most important and most difficult issues of American foreign policy, and he has done so in ways that shed light on our options and their consequences. Please help me welcome Professor Stephen Walt.
Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here in Missoula, and I want to thank the lecture committee and President Dennison, and especially Karen, for that very nice introduction. There is an old joke that you say after introductions like that, which I'm now going to repeat, which is something like, I wish my parents could have been here to hear it. My father would have been proud, and my mother would have believed it all. Today is the 5th anniversary of the attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, and many Americans have been reflecting on that experience and then what has happened in the 5 years subsequently. And in that sense, I think it's appropriate to be speaking here on the topic of American foreign policy. I often tell my students when I lecture about great wars of the past and great international problems that these are always enormous human tragedies, and one of the ways we redeem the losses in those tragedies is by trying to learn as much as possible from them and from the events surrounding them. So what I'm going to try to do today is at least contribute in some way to the process of mutual education that should follow a tragedy like that, so we get something positive out of something that is otherwise a horrific national experience. If you think back, though, before September 11th to the early 1990s, it was a period of tremendous optimism about world politics in general and about America's role in it. There was a real sense that the wind was at America's back, that we were destined to play the central role in an increasingly benevolent world order. And there were good reasons for this optimism. We'd won the Cold War. We had avoided an all-out global war while doing it. We had defeated Iraq quite handily in the first Gulf War and demonstrated quite remarkable military capabilities in doing that. It's not surprising that President George H.W. Bush then spoke of the United States standing, quote, on the pinnacle of power with the rarest opportunity to reshape the world. Democracy was spreading in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union and in Latin America, and other ideological alternatives to democracy seemed utterly discredited. Competitive markets were re-emerging in the former communist world and also spreading in other parts of the world as well. There was a general sense that people around the world were embracing many parts of the American model. Tom Friedman's book, Lexus and the Olive Branch, talked about the golden straitjacket of institutions, rule of law, education, free markets that all countries would have to put on if they wanted to be prosperous. The Oslo peace agreements brought new hope of a lasting Arab-Israeli peace, and pundits like Charles Krauthammer wrote of the unipolar moment. Frank Fukuyama wrote about the end of history, and a little bit later, scholars like William Woolforth and Neil Ferguson wrote about the beneficial and stabilizing effects of American dominance. And finally, we spent most of the 90s with a pretty healthy economy, ended up balancing the federal budget for the first time in decades. So it really looked like everything was going our way. Now, some 15 years after the end of the Cold War, the world doesn't look quite as good as we thought. Some of the optimism turns out to have been justified. If you look actually globally, the level of overall global violence is significantly lower than it was at earlier periods of history, but somehow it doesn't look quite as good as we thought it was all going to be. Russian democracy has proven imperfect, somewhat fragile. Many former Soviet republics mired in corruption. There's a completely unanticipated threat from a global terrorist network. We knew it was out there, we just didn't take it seriously enough. The Middle East peace process deteriorated dramatically after the failures at Camp David, the outbreak of the Second Intifada, the election of Hamas, the recent war in Lebanon. Since 1990, we've witnessed ethnic cleansing in the Balkans, genocide in Rwanda and Burundi, another one underway in Darfur. North Korea, Iran, Pakistan, India have all advanced their nuclear weapons programs. We did manage to set up the World Trade Organization, but all subsequent efforts to lower barriers to trade have failed. There's been some backsliding on democracy and free market progress in Latin America, and there's a growing sense, even in the United States, that our dominant position may be a bit more fragile. And last but not least, America's image around the world has declined dramatically in virtually every region. According to a BBC poll in January 2005, of 21 different countries, in 15 out of those 21 countries, a majority of the people surveyed thought America's influence in the world was negative. A more recent poll of 33 countries found that a majority saw the U.S. role as positive in only 14 out of 33. By contrast, France was seen as a positive force in the world in 28 out of 33, China in 20 out of 33. We're tied with Russia at 14. And finally, if you look at the Pew Global Attitudes Survey, the percent of people responding